I found gold while I was metal detecting, and a veteran claims he found it first. But all he was taking home was failure. I got into detecting about 2 years ago, and I did it the right way from the first day. I joined the local club, I read the rules twice, and most of all, I asked permission before I ever put a coil over somebody else's dirt. There was a farmer named Doyle who let me search his backfield. He signed a plain one-page agreement saying I could detect there and that anything of value would be split 50-50 between the finder and the landowner, which is exactly how it is supposed to work. I swept that field on and off for a year and pulled up nothing but rusted nails, bottle caps, and one very sad tractor bolt. Then one cold morning, I got a signal I had never heard before, low and wide and screaming. I dug down about a foot and my trowel touched clay. It was a broken pot and packed inside it were coins, gold ones, old ones, dozens of them, stacked so tight they had fused into a dull yellow brick. My hands were shaking so hard I had to sit back on my heels. This was the find people chase their whole lives and never get. I was still kneeling in the mud when I heard a voice behind me say, "Well, would you look at that?" It was Cliff, one of the old-timers from the club. He had been working the field on the other side of the hedge, the one that isn't Doyle's, and he had climbed the fence line the second he saw me digging. He crouched down beside the hole, looked at the coins for a long moment and said, "You know this is my patch, right? I've been working this ground for years. That's my find." I told him it wasn't his field and it wasn't his find. I told him I had written permission from Doyle and he had just come over a fence. Cliff smiled at me the way you smile at a child who has said something adorable and wrong. "Son, I was detecting these fields before you could walk. Everyone in the club knows this is my ground. You're going to hand those over." I said no. I bagged the coins carefully, left the broken pot sitting in the hole exactly where it lay, and told him the find would be reported properly with my name on it because I found it. Cliff stood up, brushed the dirt off his knees and said, "We'll see about that." He drove off. I thought that was the end of it. It was not. By that night, Cliff had called the club president, a man named Warren, and told him an entire invented history. He said he had been searching that spot for years, that he had told me about it in confidence, and that I had jumped his hole and grabbed a find that was rightfully his. Warren rang me, and before I could get a full sentence out, he said, "Cliff says you took a find off his patch. That's a serious thing in this club. We don't jump each other's spots." I said Cliff had never had permission for that field, that Doyle had signed only with me, and that Cliff came over the fence after I was already elbow deep in the hole. Warren said, "Cliff's been in this club 30 years. He wouldn't lie about this." So overnight, I became the new guy who stole a legend's gold. At the next meeting, it got worse. Cliff stood up in front of everybody and said, "I found the signal on that pot a week ago and left it to come back with better gear. This kid saw where I'd been digging and pulled it out from under me. That gold is mine." People looked at me like I had taken something out of their own pockets. A couple of them shook their heads. Warren announced that the club would support Cliff's claim as the finder when the coins were reported. Cliff sat with his arms folded, pleased as anything, and said across the room, "Should have just handed them over. Would have been easier on you." I felt sick because it looked like it was actually going to work. He was the veteran and I was nobody. But there is a process for a find like that. Gold that old has to be reported to the finds officer, and it cannot be recorded on somebody's say-so. Two things have to be established: who found it and whose land it came from, because the reward gets split between finder and landowner. That second part is where Cliff's whole story came apart. When the finds officer began her checks, she needed the landowner's details, so she drove out to Doyle. Doyle told her plainly that exactly one person had ever held written permission to detect his land, and that person was me, and he had the signed agreement in his desk to prove it. She asked about Cliff. Doyle said, "Cliff, he asked me years ago, and I told him no. If he was on my field, he was there without my say-so." That alone sank the claim, because you cannot be the rightful finder on ground you were never allowed to stand on. Then she asked Cliff to describe when and how he uncovered the pot. Cliff, still committed, said he had dug it out a week earlier and left it in place. She asked me the same question. I told her I had opened that hole myself, in ground that had never been turned, and the pot came up sealed with the coins still packed inside. A vessel that had been excavated a week before does not settle back into undisturbed soil with its contents intact. His own account contradicted what was physically in the hole. Then she checked his movements for that week and found he had been at a rally 2 counties over on the exact day he swore he was uncovering the pot. He could not have found it a week early because he was not there. Warren had nothing to say. The fines officer recorded me as the finder, full stop. The hoard was real, the valuation went through, and the reward was split between me and Doyle exactly the way the paper always said it would be. Cliff got nothing. I figured that was the end. It was not, because a man who spent 30 years building a reputation on smoke does not walk away quietly when the smoke clears. He started making calls before I had even left the hall. A few days after the ruling, my phone rang, and it was Hagar, one of the few members who had been decent to me since I joined. "You need to know what's going on," she said. "Cliff has been calling people all week. He's telling everyone the fines officer botched the investigation and that you talked Doyle into backing your story. He's saying you paid Doyle off. Half the club believes it. Paid him off. With what? I am a regular person with a regular job who spends his weekends waving a coil over farmland and eating cold sandwiches out of a truck bed. But that is the thing about a lie like that. It does not have to make sense. It only has to sound good to people who already want it to be true. And Cliff had 3 decades of goodwill saved up and was spending every penny of it. The next meeting was that Thursday, and I almost skipped it. I went anyway because not showing up looks like guilt. The room went quiet when I walked in. Not the ordinary quiet of people settling into chairs, the other kind, where every conversation stops at the same instant because the subject of all of them just came through the door. Eyes on me, then off me. 2 men at the back whispered. Nobody said hello. Warren cleared his throat like he had been waiting for me. "Before regular business," he said, reading off a sheet, "a formal complaint has been filed requesting that this member's membership be reviewed for conduct unbecoming, specifically claim jumping and dishonesty. Under our bylaws, the club will vote on expulsion at the next meeting." Expulsion, not because I did anything wrong, but because he lost. I opened my mouth and Warren put a hand up. "This isn't a trial. There'll be time to speak at the vote." Men I had shared tea with in freezing fields, men who taught me how to log a spot and clean a coin, stared at the table. Then one of the older members said, loud enough to carry, "Should have just given the old man his due. That's how it works around here." A few nodded, and that was when it clicked. This was not about the gold anymore. Cliff knew the coins were gone. He had changed the game. If he could not have the find, he would take everything else. My name, my place, my ability to detect anywhere in the county without people muttering that I was the one who robbed a veteran. He wanted winning to feel like losing. Sitting in that room, I understood that being right was not going to be enough on its own. Hagar caught my arm by the door afterward. "Go see Doyle," she said. "He's the landowner. If he stands up and says it was all above board, nobody can keep pushing the bribe story. And do it before the vote. You've got 2 weeks." So I drove out the next morning, and Doyle was already waiting on his porch with coffee going cold in his hand and a look on his face like somebody had insulted his mother. I did not get half a sentence out before he set the cup on the railing. "That friend of yours came by yesterday," he said. "Cliff stood right where you're standing and told me to tear up our agreement and sign a new one with him instead. Offered me 70%. I asked what he said back. I told him to get off my land before I found someone to remove him. I told that man no 10 years ago, and he still doesn't hear it. Then he looked me in the eye and said you'd tricked me into signing a bad deal, like I'm too old to read a page of print." He said the last part slowly, one word angrier than the one before, and I understood. Cliff had walked onto this man's property and called him a fool to his face. Doyle wasn't annoyed. He was insulted down to the bone. He picked the cup back up without drinking from it and stared out at the field where the coins came from. "I've farmed this ground 40 years, he said. "Nobody tells me who gets on my property." Then he turned. "So, why are you out here this early?" I told him everything. The complaint, the vote, the calls, the story that I had bought his testimony. His jaw tightened as I talked. When I finished, he said, "So he loses, comes to my house to buy me, and now he wants you thrown out. What kind of club is this?" I said it wasn't the whole club, that there were people like Hagar who saw straight through him, but that the ones who believed Cliff were louder. I asked if he would come to the meeting and say all of it out loud. He didn't pause for a breath. "You tell me when and where. I'll be there, and I'll bring the paper we signed and the one he tried to get me to sign yesterday." I stared at him. "He left a paper?" Doyle nodded. "Wrote it out himself. His name, my name, the 70-30 split, a line at the bottom for my signature. Brought his own pen. Thought I'd sign it right there on the porch and throw away the deal I already had." Cliff had put the bribe in writing, in his own hand, and Doyle still had it. That was not a rumor or a version of events. That was a document. Proof that after the fines officer ruled, he had tried to tamper with the landowner agreement itself. "I kept it because I figured it might matter one day," Doyle said. Didn't know when. 40 years of farming teaches a man to keep record. He folded it back into a brown envelope and wrote the date on the flap in pencil while I stood there watching, and it struck me that this old farmer had done in in 10 seconds what I had spent 2 weeks failing to do, which was stop reacting and start building a case. I had been defending myself. He was collecting. That afternoon, I called Eloise, the fines officer, and told her what was happening at the club. I asked if she could put her findings in writing. She didn't hesitate. It's all in my case notes. I can send you a formal summary. The landowner confirmation, the timeline contradiction, all of it. Then her voice changed. You should understand something. What he did wasn't just a false claim. If he's pressuring the landowner to switch agreements and filing complaints on information he knows is false, that edges toward attempting to fraudulently obtain treasure. There are laws about this. It isn't only a club matter. I sat at my dining table afterward and let that settle. He had lied to the club, lied to the fines officer, driven to a farm, and offered a man money to change his story, and he was still going. Eloise's summary landed 2 days later, printed clean and flat in official language, and reading it laid out in order made it worse than I remembered. Then Hagar called 3 days before the vote. The mood is shifting, she said. He keeps changing details. Told one man he dug the pot Tuesday mid-morning. Told another it was Wednesday afternoon. People are noticing. When a story's true, you don't fumble the basics. He had been so focused on the big lie that he never kept the small ones straight. The night before the meeting, Warren called me himself, and his voice was different, careful. Heads up, Cliff's bringing 3 members to speak on his behalf. They're going to say they saw you on that field before you had permission. I'm not saying I believe it. Just come ready. 3 people willing to stand up in front of everyone and put me somewhere I had never been. Then a text came through an hour later. Cliff was threatening to file with the national organization to have the find re-examined, claiming new evidence. I called Hagar. He's bluffing, she said. A man with new evidence doesn't announce it the night before. He shows up and uses it. He's trying to scare you into staying home. She was right. And she was right about the other thing too. You can't argue 3 men down one at a time. Make Doyle speak first. Once the room hears from the man who owns the dirt, those 3 are just liars backing a liar. I did not sleep. I lay in the dark running the order of it over and over, and somewhere around 4 in the morning I stopped thinking about Cliff entirely and started thinking about an old man in a chair on a porch saying he would be there. I got to the hall 40 minutes early with my folder on the seat beside me. Hagar was already there and gave me a nod. 20 minutes out, I heard a truck in the lot and watched Doyle climb down in a pressed button-down shirt, carrying a folder of his own. He sat in the back row and set it on his lap and waited like a man who had already decided how the evening was going to end. Then people came in, more than I had ever seen at a meeting, filling every row and lining the back wall. Members who skipped winter sessions were there. Word had traveled. Cliff arrived last, 3 men walking in behind him like an escort, and he was cheerful, scanning the room the way a host scans a party. He gave Warren a slow nod, as if the 2 of them had settled it already, and this was just the announcement. Warren read the complaint aloud and set the page down. Before I could speak, Cliff was on his feet. 30 years I've given this club. I taught half of you how to swing a coil. I've driven 3 hours to help a stranger on his first dig. I've put my own money into rallies when the budget came up short. And I'm not going to stand here while a kid with 2 years in takes what's mine and paints me as the villain. 4 or 5 people clapped, and in a quiet room, 4 or 5 sounds like more. And you should all know I've contacted the national organization, he added, looking straight at me. This isn't over even if you vote wrong tonight. The room buzzed. Warren raised a hand. 3 members have asked to speak on behalf of the complainant. We'll hear them first. The first stood, a man 15 years in. I saw this young man on Doyle's field months before he claims he got permission, walking it like he owned it. Didn't think much of it then. Makes sense now. He sat. The second, Cliff told me about that pot location weeks before this kid found anything. Said he had a big signal to go back for. Clear as day. He sat. The third, at a dig day last spring, this young man was bragging about hitting a spot Cliff had been working. Said he'd get there first. He sat, and I felt the room tilt like a boat taking water down one side. 3 separate men, 3 separate claims, and to anyone who did not know better, it sounded like a pattern. I stood up. Cliff didn't even turn. Let the members speak. You'll get your turn. Warren agreed, and I sat back down with my mouth shut, and in that silence I understood the arithmetic. 1 voice against 4 is a fight I lose every time, no matter how loudly I insist. I did not need to argue with them. I needed all 4 claims to fall at once, from underneath, from a source not one person in that hall could question. I looked at the back row. Doyle was watching Cliff the way a man watches somebody dig, patient, unhurried, already knowing how deep it would go. He gave me 1 small nod. I turned to Warren and said, I'd like to call 1 witness, the man who owns the land. The room went dead. Every head turned. Cliff's smile, the one he had worn since the door, was gone. Doyle buttoned his jacket, carried his folder down the aisle, Doyle, and Warren stepped aside without being asked. "My name is Doyle," he said. "I farmed that land 40 years. My father farmed it before me. I know every fence post and every drainage ditch on it. One person has ever had my written permission to detect my backfield." He raised his hand and pointed at me. He's standing right there. He opened the folder, lifted out the agreement, and held it high enough for the back wall to read. Dated over a year ago. His name on it. Nobody else's. 2 copies, both signed. Then he turned his head toward Cliff, slow and flat. "You asked me for permission 10 years ago. I said no. You asked again 5 years ago. I said no again. You were never welcome on my land." Warren cleared his throat. "3 members made claims tonight about seeing him on your field before the agreement. Can you speak to that?" Doyle didn't blink. "I don't know what these men think they saw. Nobody crosses my field without me knowing. I eat breakfast looking straight out at it every morning of my life. If he'd been out there months early, I'd have run him off myself, same as anyone." Then he looked directly at the first witness. "Were you watching my property? Because I never saw you out there either." The man studied his own shoes and said nothing. The other 2 didn't lift their heads. Then Doyle reached into the folder again and brought out a second sheet. "This is what Cliff carried to my house last week. He drove up uninvited and asked me to tear up the agreement and sign with him instead. 70% instead of 50. When I said no, he told me I'd been tricked into a bad deal. Like I can't read." He laid it on the table in front of Warren, firmly, the way you set down a full stop. "That's his handwriting. That's his offer. He brought his own pen and expected me to sign it on my porch. You want to know who the dishonest man in this room is? It's the one who tried to buy a landowner to steal another man's find." The quiet after that was a different quiet than before. Cliff shot up fast, the way a man moves when the floor goes soft. "That's not what happened. I was making sure Doyle got a fair deal. This kid was taking advantage of him. I was looking out for Doyle. Doyle turned on him so quickly the front row leaned back. Don't you dare. I'm standing right here. You sat on my porch and called me a fool to my face. I'm 72 years old and I've run a farm longer than you've owned a detector. Don't you stand there and tell this room it was for my benefit." Cliff looked around for one nod, one pair of eyes that would meet his. His 3 witnesses were staring at the floor. The men who clapped for him were studying the walls. Nobody gave him anything. Warren picked up the offer and read it to himself, and I watched his mouth tighten and his brows pull in. He set it down without a word. That was my moment. I opened my folder and read only what mattered. The fines officer's investigation confirmed that on the date Cliff claims he uncovered the pot, he was at a detecting rally 2 counties away. His attendance was documented. He was not on that field. I looked up. It also states that his account of digging the pot and leaving it was contradicted by the site itself. The vessel was sealed in undisturbed ground, and it confirms that sole written permission was granted to one person and that Cliff held no authorization to be on the property at any point. I set the summary on the table beside his offer. 2 pages, side by side. One from an official with no reason to take a side, one written in his own hand. Together they said it better than I ever could. Warren looked at the papers, then at Cliff, then at me, and stood. "I owe you an apology. I took Cliff's word because I've known him 30 years. I didn't ask enough questions. That was wrong." Then he turned. "Cliff, your membership is suspended effective immediately. I'm recommending a permanent ban at the committee meeting, and if you've contacted the national organization with false information, I'll be contacting them myself with everything on this table." Cliff's face went red, not the embarrassed kind, the kind that comes from something breaking inside a man that he cannot put back. He looked around the room one last time, slower, hunting for a single believer. He grabbed his jacket and walked the aisle while people pulled their knees aside to let him pass. He stopped level with me, close enough that I could see the muscle working in his jaw. I didn't move. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. He closed it, looked away, and pushed through the door, and it shut behind him with a flat click that was louder than it had any right to be. Then a hand landed on my shoulder. "Doyle, you did it the right way," he said. "That's all that matters." I nodded because I didn't trust my voice. The room broke open after that. Chairs scraped, men came over and shook my hand, some of them for the first time since the whole thing started. One who had not said a word all night took my hand in both of his and said, "Good on you, seriously." Warren waited until nearly everyone had gone, then came over and held out his hand and didn't let go right away. "Welcome to the club," he said. "For real this time." His name is still on the roster board in the hall, taped over with a strip of masking tape nobody has bothered to peel off.